Last lecture we focused on the fundamentals of what intelligence is, how it's measured, and this time we're going to talk about what gives you that score. So not just the different types of intelligence and how we can look at it. Now we're going to look at what is contributing to that ultimate number that you get on your IQ test. Is it genetic? Is it environmental? Or, as is what we're going to see the case, it's a combination of both genetic and environmental factors. And we're going to talk about how these influence what your achievability is on any one of these measures for intelligence. So the first thing we want to talk about is the natural bell curve. So in this visual right here, this is the distribution of scores on the WAIS, which is the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Score, or scale rather. So it averages at 100, right? We norm the test so that most people that take it are going to get it within the 100 range, right? That's the average. And then it actually is nicely distributed on both sides of the coin, with roughly the same amount of people being above average as are below average. The cutoff points that we look at for ability are 2 standard deviations from the mean. So if you were to look at this and imagine that there was a line going down the middle, that's the mean, right? It's also the median and the mode, but this one's the mean right here. And 1 standard deviation in this direction of positive intelligence score gives you a score of 115. 1 standard deviation in the other direction gives you the score of 85. So from this we can determine that the standard deviation is 15. So the cutoff points for intelligence, normal intelligence, are 2 standard deviations above and below the mean. So anything below 70 is considered mental retardation, and anything above 135, right, we are actually pushing it a little bit higher, is considered high intelligence. So basically we're looking at 2 standard deviations above and below the mean as being completely normal. So if you're an individual that has an IQ of 75, that's not bad. That's not average, but it's not abnormal either. So we use this as a scale of measuring how people score on a specific given test. Is it predictive of their abilities to perform in the workplace? Absolutely not. It's a good measure of how certain people may perform in certain positions, but what we see is that factors like interpersonal ability and interacting with others is more important than simple intelligence. I mean, just think about those guys on The Big Bang Theory. It's unrealistic the way they're portrayed in a number of ways because they're so ill prepared to handle social situations. Sheldon comes to mind. He would not last long in many academic environments because he doesn't know how to deal with people. He could be brilliant, but if he can't deal with people, he's not going to last very long unless his brilliance is so overwhelming that it overcomes the struggles that he has with interpersonal interaction. So the reason I say that is if you are not of over 100 intelligence, it's important for you to know that that's perfectly normal. Unless you're below 70 or above 130, 135, you're perfectly average, perfectly normal. You're not all that special or worse off. Now, the biggest, most important component of intelligence is absolutely genetic. We see that environment plays a very important role. But as with almost all things, genetics set the stage of what you're capable of. So what we see here in this graph is it's looking at intelligence scores for different styles of individuals. So on the far left, we have identical twins that were reared together. So not only do they have identical genetics, but they have a very similar environment. It's not the exact same environment because they have different lifetime experiences. So identical twins don't have a 100% shared environment, but they have a very similar shared environment. And what we see with these individuals is that their intelligence is at 0.85 correlation. Now, the highest correlation that you can get for anything is 1.0, right? Because nothing can be more than perfectly aligned. You can't get more perfect than perfect. So for a correlation to be 0.85, that's huge. That's unheard of. we look at correlations of 0.35 as being pretty significant. So for it to be 0.85, it's clear that there is a genetic component. It's not, you can't even deny it. Now, to further emphasize the importance of the genetic component, look one bar over and we see that those are identical twins that were reared apart. So, sure, there's an environmental effect there, because it's not 0.85 like the other twins. But it's over 0.7, which again is huge. So with that level of correlation, what we see is that there's definitely a genetic component, but there is also an environmental component as well, and that environmental component is very important, specifically with dealing with your personal achievement ability. Next lines down, we see fraternal twins reared together. That kind of gives us the idea of the fact that there's an environmental effect, and that there is definitely that genetic effect as well, because we see that there's this difference between the fraternal and the identical. So this sort of, the difference here gives greater credence to the idea on this side that there is that genetic component. Farther down, we see the siblings reared together are really, there's going to be that genetic component because they have the same parents, but it's not going to be as profound. There's, I'm going to pull an example from my own, my own experience, which is that, I look at my nieces, and, they have the same parents, and I love them both. I think they're both brilliant little girls, but intelligence-wise, I do believe that one of them is smarter than the other. And that has nothing to do with, any failing on the part of their parents or anything like that. It's just that genetically speaking, they got a different hand. The same is true with environment. They have a slightly different environment. So those two things are going to work together to impact how those individuals perform. And then lastly, we see the general population is correlated, but not that much, and that's just unrelated individuals reared together. We do see some environmental factor, and we see a rough environmental factor of about 32% or 0.32 for the correlation. So what we believe from this is that intelligence is more driven by genetics than by environment, but that they are both extremely important in determining what your intelligence quotient is going to be. To further sort of emphasize the importance of genetics in the development of an intelligence, this is the way that we look at twin studies, but we also look at adoption studies. And adoption studies are really important because we get rid of the idea of looking at just twins. So in this study, what we do is we look at the child and their birth parents, the adopted child and the adopted child's birth parents, and then the adopted child and their adoptive parents. So what we see here is, at 3 years, correlations are pretty low when it comes to verbal ability for all groups, because the children haven't had a chance to really develop and display their intelligence. But by 16 years, we see that there's a much higher correlation. And we see that birth families, right? So these are the two ones where we're comparing the birth children to the birth parents. In this one, they have a shared environment because they live together. In this one, the birth child and birth parent do not have a shared environment, but they're genetically related. What we see is that they are far more correlated with regards to verbal ability than adopted children are with their adoptive parents. So what I mean here is that having adoptive parents can absolutely impact your life in a number of different ways, but intelligence is not one of them. You can do a lot to encourage them to reach their maximum potential, but that doesn't mean that you're going to have them be as smart as you or as dumb as you. You can't push them beyond the bounds of what they're capable of. So this is sort of just reiterating what I said, basically that fraternal twins that are raised together have similarity in their intelligence scores, and that intelligence or identical twins raised apart are slightly less similar on their intelligence scores than identical twins raised together. So identical twins raised apart are much more similar on their intelligence scores than fraternal twins who are raised together. So it's really emphasizing that genetic component, but the fact that there's a strong environmental component as well. So I mentioned that there's not much you can do with regards to getting an adopted child to be similar to their adoptive parent. But there is a lot that you can do to make an individual child reach their maximum potential. And we call these early intervention effects. So when it comes to a lot of your development, early childhood is very important because it sets the stage for your entire life. So I don't want to put a lot of pressure on your parents that have young children, but the reality is that what you're dealing with these young kids right now is you're setting them up for life, for how they're going to expect things to happen in the world, how they're going to operate on the world, and how they're going to live their lives. And what we see is that children that experience early neglect from their caregivers have some diminished intelligence scores as a result of this. So they don't have a feeling of personal control over their environment because they're not given a chance to operate on the environment. So giving children, I talked when we were talking about development, how Piaget viewed, children as little scientists, that they operate on the world in a way of understanding the world, and that in doing so, they learn, and they develop some of their own ideas about what the world means. Well, when you neglect a child and you don't give them the opportunities to use any personal control, then they have more difficulty learning. So they miss out on some opportunities to develop creativity and ultimately to develop their ability to perform well on intelligence tests. So this is a picture of a young child in the Romanian orphanages that we've talked about a couple times, where they had so many orphans and so few caregivers for them that they had minimal interaction with other human beings. And as a result of that, these infants that were in these orphanages had diminished intelligence scores from what would be expected when compared to the national norms. So this is why we have programs like Head Start, because many of the kids that get put into Head Start programs or programs of something that's aimed at early intervention for children, oftentimes they are aimed towards children that may be at a greater disadvantage. That's because children that come from wealthier homes are more likely to have access to educational toys, programs that are going to help them develop on their own. But when you look at more impoverished areas, or children of single parents where they may not have the same amount of ability to interact with their parents, Head Start can prove to be amazingly beneficial. The key, though, is keeping those interests active after Head Start ends. So Head Start can be great, and then you put them in school, and then the children just wilt away again because they don't have that same support system. So it's very important to keep encouraging children to explore their environment and act on their environment, because doing so relates to higher intelligence scores. Increased schooling, and not the type of schooling that we're doing now where we're teaching to the test. Increased schooling where you actually get to learn in a way that engages you, in a way that's not themed necessarily towards taking tests, but actively engaging you to learn concepts. Those are going to reflect themselves well in your intelligence scores. So after-school programs are a great way to encourage this, and it's a great way for parents to kind of push their kids off for a little while. It gives them an opportunity to experience interacting with other kids, learning how to socialize, but it also gives them an opportunity to learn how things work in the real world. They learn physics by throwing things. They learn from experience, and giving them the opportunities to do so is going to dramatically increase their intelligence scores. It's going to help them reach that maximum potential. So with that information, and I answered a little bit of this sort of in the previous section, why would we then have groups that differ on intelligence? And what do those differences mean? So one of the big ways that we look at this is racial differences in intelligence. So there is a well-documented racial difference with average intelligence scores. We also see, and this is well agreed upon, that people that score high on intelligence tests tend to attain higher levels of education and therefore higher levels of income, especially if they have good social skills. So, let's look at a specific group. We're going to look at white Americans versus black Americans. So the average IQ for a white American is 100. The average IQ for a black American is 85. So what does this mean? Well, there's one conclusion that you could draw, and we see, actually, let me mention that as well. Hispanic Americans fall right smack in the middle, between 100 and 85. So what does this mean? You know, you could come to one conclusion, which is black Americans are less intelligent than white Americans. That's one conclusion you could draw. But it has to be tested. And there has to be some empirical evidence to support that. And there also has to be some evidence in the literature that sort of suggests that that's a viable hypothesis. And it turns out that there are even more viable hypotheses as to why this disparity exists. And we're going to discuss those, because the fact of the matter is that if you look through history, people who come from a European ancestry and people who come from an African ancestry, they are not more or less likely to be successful when you look at historical data. Some of the greatest thinkers in this world were African thinkers. Some of the the greatest developments in humanity happened in the Middle East. So it's not necessarily, there's very little evidence to support the idea that these racial differences are the result of actual achievement possibility within those individuals. So what it turns out we may be measuring with IQ is not necessarily what your mental ability is, but where you're at right now on a given measure, and whether or not that measure might be biased. So one of the first things that we look at is culture bias. And Janet Helms is one of the real leaders behind this research, which is the idea that IQs are culturally biased in favor of specifically white males. So IQ tests currently are measuring skills that are going to be obtained by middle-class European American children. So for example, if you're going to look at a test of IQ for young children, one of the questions that might be asked is, which side of the plate does the salad fork go on? Now that is a culturally biased question, and not just necessarily biased by race, that's biased by socioeconomic status. So people that are more wealthy, of more middle-class European American upbringing, would be more likely to know that answer to that question. I came from, I don't want to say abject poverty, but I came from a relatively poor lifestyle when I was growing up. My dad had 3 jobs to support us. My mom had 1 job to support us, and we were not well off. We slept in 1 room during the winter because we only had heat in 1 room. So with that in mind, if I were given that question, I wouldn't know. When I was a little kid, I would have no idea. I'd be like, what's a salad fork? You get 1 fork. You don't get 2 forks, you get 1 fork. What's a salad fork? So that's an example of how we need to re-examine the questions that we're asking and what those questions mean to different socioeconomic groups. So that's one issue. The other issue is the fact that a lot of the tests, especially the children's tests, were designed, developed, and normed on male children. As a result, it's to be expected that boys and girls are going to answer questions differently. That's just how boys and girls operate. There are gender differences in everything. It's not deniable. So, with that in mind, if you create a test with one group of people, which is white males, can you really expect it to extend beyond white males and reflect what females, African Americans, Asians are truly capable of? Well, there's a lot of argument that says you can't. So now, what we try to do is we try to develop culture-fair IQ tests. Unfortunately, they're not going to be culture-free because we all have expectations and experiences based on our culture. So, looking at this, we would be more likely to get similar scores for people of different groups by using a culture-fair, picture-based IQ test. Not all IQ tests can contain all pictures. Obviously, that's not going to work for every question. But what we see is that when you include more culture fair questions, the disparities between groups begin to shrink. In addition to this, in addition to the fact that the tests are very much biased in favor of white males, in addition to that, there's also some experiential differences that are really important, and those are the environmental effects. So we have to look at how white Americans and black Americans grow up in this country. Now, it's not a disputed fact anywhere that black children are more likely to be raised by a single parent than white children. So with that in mind, it's going to give them different opportunities. And so what we see is that, let's say that this is a family, right? And this is a family in a lower socioeconomic group, and this is a family in a higher socioeconomic group. So all these flowers, right, they grow at different heights within the group. So this is the impact of genetics, the difference that we see here. The same is true on the wealthier family. There's mild variations between them, right? So this guy right here is the smartest. This guy right here, he's got the lower IQ. But the more profound difference is what we see between this whole family and this whole family. So they had the same, overall, the same genetic possibility. But because the ones in the poor socioeconomic status had access to fewer resources and fewer opportunities, they weren't able to grow as much. They didn't get as much sunlight and they didn't get as much water and minerals, right? Whereas this crop over here, these guys had access to everything that they might need to grow as much as possible. So they had plenty of sunlight. Someone came out and put fertilizer down for the flowers, made sure they were watered every day. So clearly we're going to see that these guys score higher than these guys. So part of the reason why we see the disparity between these groups is because of bias. And part of the reason why we see the disparity between these groups is because of real-world experiences called environmental effects. So these are some visuals for how profound the disparity is between these ethnic groups and how we might explain it and understand. So what we see is that in America, white and Asians overall have roughly comparable income. But you jump down here and we see that black Americans and Hispanic Americans make significantly less, almost half as much income as their white and Asian counterparts. The difference is more linear in Dallas-Fort Worth, but nonetheless, the fact remains that white Americans, on average, tend to make significantly more money than non-white peers. So this is part of the explanation for why white individuals tend to score better on IQ tests. They just have access to better resources. Is it fair? Hell no. But it's reality. And that's part of why we have the difference between these scores. That's part of why we need to consider that when we talk about the differences between these groups. But it's not just the USA that experiences this. What we see is that in other countries, the same is true, and we see that in these other countries, the minorities that have less access to quality resources perform less well on IQ measures as well. So it's not race, it's access to resources and ability. And in the UK, those that suffer the most are Pakistani and Bangladeshi UK citizens. Those are the ones that fare the worst, and as a result, those are the ones that tend to score lower on the tests. So it's, in this regard, it's simple math. It's very unfortunate, but it is the way that it works out. So let's talk about some specific reasons for how environment affects the intelligence scores. When we look at measures of infant intelligence, we see that the races perform very, very similar. So the reason why this is true is because, genetically speaking, the races are completely similar. I mean, it's the difference between a white man and a black man, genetically speaking, is so tiny, minuscule. I mean, it's skin pigmentation and hair pigmentation and a few facial features. I mean, we are so alike genetically. And in fact, race is something that has been created by people. And you can see this when you think about, when you ask somebody, well, what are the different racial categories? And many people might say, oh, well, there's white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Middle Eastern, and that's it. But if you ask somebody in Africa, what are the different races? Well, depending on their region, they might start listing tribal differences. They might name the names of different tribes in their region that are different races to them. So race is a social category. It's how we group people. And, you could say, you could say Hispanic. That's one race that you could break it down in. But my dad grew up in Venezuela. He spent a significant period of his childhood in Venezuela. And, he is really adept at picking out which country an individual comes from in South America. And he can do it as well with, with Mexico and the Dominican Republic and all of that. He's very skilled at that because it was an important part of where he grew up. So race is a social construct. One of the things that we see with Asian students outperforming North American students on math achievement and aptitude is largely an environmental factor where that is emphasized by many of the parents. I mean, come on, we all know the the Asian dad meme with the why get an A, that type of thing. Well, that is in large part due to the reality of the fact that Asian families tend to emphasize mathematical achievement more than white families. In addition, what we see, and we talked about this last time, when we talked about, what I told you was known as the Flynn effect, which was that we have to renorm the IQ test every couple of years because we learn so much more as a society that, if I were to take an IQ test from the 1930s, I would probably be labeled a genius. So would you. Because the fact of the matter is that the IQ tests of the 1930s were very simple because we already know all that stuff now. We've moved beyond that. That's a reality of the IQ test and part of why it's not a thing. It's a very fluid concept. And I mentioned this earlier that white and black infants tend to score equally well on the infant IQ tests. And then, this also goes back to what I said earlier about the different cultures, which is that in different time periods in our evolutionary history and in our recent history of our species, we see that different ethnic groups have gone above and beyond what could be seen now for that ethnic group. So that really speaks to the fact that it really comes down to not only the genetic component, but the access to the resources. If you have access to resources, you're going to perform better. There's no question about it. So when the Middle East was developing all these scientific accomplishments, well, it's no surprise that they were one of the wealthiest areas in the whole world at that point in time. They were opening up trade routes. They were doing everything they could, and as a result of that, they were living a comfortable, happy life that enabled them to perform well and develop a lot of really interesting achievements. So, the gender differences. I mentioned some of the racial differences, and I've already mentioned some of the gender differences as well. But what we want to know with regards to the gender is that men are overrepresented in both the extremely high and extremely low intelligence groups. As a whole, men do tend to perform about 4 points better on intelligence tests. And the gender difference, like I said, is more profound in the extremities. So on here, I just list, the extremely intelligence range, but the same is true for subpar intelligence as well. Part of the reason for this is that men tend to perform better on mathematical and spatial reasoning questions, and a lot of the questions are themed towards mathematical and spatial reasoning questions. So as a result of that, the tests which were designed by men, for men, tend to score with men scoring higher. Is that surprising to anybody? It really shouldn't be. If it's surprising to you, then you haven't been paying attention in my class. Because the reality here is that if you design something specifically for a group of person, can you extrapolate that out to all groups of people? The answer is no. So some ways that this, sort of comes out And the way that we can sort of see that it's not necessarily true that men are by virtue more intelligent than women is the ways that the different genders form, the ways that they perform on different measures. Girls are far better spellers than boys on average. They have better vocabularies, they're more fluent with their verbal usage. They're also better at locating objects, which is something that is one of my favorite pieces of evidence in support of evolutionary psychology. Because the idea here, part of the reasoning for why we believe that girls developed a better ability at locating objects, is because if you look back at our ancestral past, as a whole, men tended to be the hunters and women tended to be the gatherers. So men are better at spatial navigation, in large part because they had to figure out the most appropriate path to attack their kill. Whereas women, they didn't need to know how to navigate through space. They just needed to remember where things were. So remember, where's a good place to find berries? As a result, women tend to be better at locating objects because of this evolutionary past. In addition, girls are more sensitive to a lot of our various senses, which could be argued as a type of intelligence. Remember, we talked about kinesthetic intelligence. But there's some other things for boys they do outperform girls with math problems, but they underperform with math computation. So it's not a solid win for the boys there. And going back to emotional intelligence as well, women tend to be more in tune to their emotions. So the idea that the test is geared towards men is part of what explains why men perform better. So the question of bias is yes, is there bias? Absolutely. So the tests are designed to be biased, though. That's the thing. They are designed to pick out differences between groups of people. Because if you have a test, one of the key things of the test is to say who performs better on the test. If you took a test in a class and it was not biased at all towards intelligence or quality of information, understanding the information, then everybody would score a 100. So tests by their very nature are designed to be biased. But they're not supposed to be biased to predict, they're not biased in the sense that they predict performance of one group over the other. So it's biased to pick out individual differences in intelligence. It's not necessarily biased towards saying that one group is better than the other. So we're looking at the individual versus the group level here. And the last thing, the last possible explanation for why we see these differences in these groups is what's known as the stereotype threat. And this is a very real threat. It's self-confirming bias against yourself. So it's the idea that you are not expected to perform well, and as a result, you don't perform well. So we see this time and time again with African Americans, and we see this with women. The women, when they're not believed that they should excel, they don't excel. The same is true of African Americans. So, one of my favorite examples of this is an experiment that I was in 4th grade. My 4th grade teacher wanted to look at gender differences and the stereotype threats. So what she did was, she noticed that many of the girls in her class weren't speaking up, and they weren't answering questions. When the year before, we had all been answering a lot of questions. So let me give you a little bit of background on the class. It was a class called Gifted and Talented, and it was it was basically the smart kids class. And we started out 3rd grade with 8 kids. It was just 8 kids, and it was the same teacher through 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade. And with the 8 kids, there were 6 girls and 2 boys, and we all answered questions. We all had a good time. It was really fun. But when we got to 4th grade, we had, I think we had like 35 students. So we had a much more even breakdown of the genders, and as a result, the girls stopped answering questions. So what she did was, we had 2 teachers, and so she split the class, boys and girls. And what she found was that in that environment, the girls were more willing to answer questions, to offer possible solutions. And as a result of that, it got rid of some of that stereotype threat, the expectation that boys are better than girls, right? So the stereotype threat is a very real concern with how people perform on academic achievement, because if they are expected to perform poorly, then they're going to perform poorly. So something to counter, always believe in yourself and know that you can do your best. If very little is expected of you, well, then just blow them away. Because if only a little bit is expected of you, even if you just barely outperform that, you're going to kick ass. So that's the end of the lecture today. You know, we talked a lot about how important the genetic component is from the very start. That's what sets you up for life. But then the environment really determines how much you're able to achieve. So that's it for this time. Next lecture, we're going to move into sensation and perception. It's going to be taught by Comicspedia. It's, seriously, you guys are going to love it. It's one of the most fun lectures out there. Kind of bummed he stole it from me because you guys are going to have fun. So ask me any questions, and we'll see you guys next time. Have a great day.